Nikki Halpin couldn't believe how well things were going. On January 8, 2004, the 32-year-old single mother was at a pizzeria in Safety Harbor, Florida, enjoying a night out with her boyfriend Chris and her sons, 7-year-old Drew and 9-year-old Max. Nikki had only been seeing Chris for a few months, and he hadn't had much interaction with her boys yet. But so far, tonight, he was nailing it. Chatting easily with Drew about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and also making sure to include Max too. When Nikki heard Max start to giggle over something Chris had said, Nikki suddenly felt this spark of happiness. She liked Chris, but until tonight, she really hadn't been convinced that their relationship had long-term potential. They'd met online, gone on a few dates, and it had been fine. Not exciting, but fine. But maybe that was okay. Chris was about her age, and he was an engineer with his life together. He checked the boxes, and maybe that was all she needed. Somebody who was solid, simple, and stable, who could make her boys laugh. I mean, that kind of relationship would certainly be a big change for Nikki. Her ex-husband, Donald, had been the opposite of Chris. He was an imposing prison guard and former boxer, built like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and was almost twice her age. They met when Nikki was just 22, and Donald was 41. Her family had thought he was too old for her, but she had fallen in love with his rugged good looks and charm. But then life got complicated. Their eldest child, Max, was born with health issues, and the endless hospital bills and stress really strained their marriage. Donald started drinking more, their fights got worse and worse, and after nearly a decade together, it was just over. They separated in 2001 and finalized the divorce 2 years later. But for Nikki, she had actually been relieved. She had her freedom back. And so pretty quickly, she had struck up another relationship with a young, fit HVAC repairman named Dan Welch. Dan had seemed really exciting and charming, and for a while, Nikki had been convinced he was the one. But Dan didn't work out. He really just wanted to have fun, not get married. And so Nikki had ultimately dumped him. After Dan, Nikki had gone on plenty more dates, but Chris was really the first guy in a long time who felt like he could actually be something real. After dinner, Nikki and her sons drove Chris back home and dropped him off around 9:30 p.m. Less than 15 minutes later, they pulled into their own driveway, where the sight of the new house they'd just recently moved into made Nikki smile. It was much bigger and nicer than anywhere she'd lived with Donald, and the city of Safety Harbor felt exactly how she'd hoped. Quiet, warm, and safe. The perfect place to raise her kids. They went inside, and immediately the boys kicked off their shoes and headed in opposite directions. Drew went to the living room to finish his homework, while Max ran straight to his bedroom and powered on his video game console. As for Nikki, she walked down the hall to her office, and she turned on the family computer. The Instant Messenger app was still open from earlier, and she glanced at the text window, and she saw there was a new message from Chris. It said, "How'd you get home so fast?" Nikki frowned, not sure why he would ask that, but when her eyes moved up the chat window, she saw that a message had been sent from her account at 9:33 p.m., while she was still out driving. The message contained only 2 letters, HB. Now, keep in mind, this was 2004, so the Instant Messenger app could not have been on Nikki's phone. It could only be accessed from her computer, which meant that that message could have only been sent from right here, this physical location, by somebody other than her. Nikki, who now had goosebumps all over her body, just stared at the screen and then typed back to Chris, "I didn't write that." Nikki grabbed her home phone and called Chris, and when he answered and she explained what was going on, he sounded confused and worried about her. Nikki asked him to please stay on the line while she looked around her house. There could be an intruder. And so while clutching the phone and doing her best to stay calm, Nikki began going from room to room, checking to make sure they were empty. All the while, the only sound that filled the house were the beeps and chimes of Max's video game. At some point, after checking one of these rooms, Nikki went back into the hallway and was going towards the next room to check. However, before she got there, she heard something and turned around. And when she did, she froze. "15 minutes later, at approximately 9:50 p.m., Deputy Brad Ferguson of the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office was out on patrol when a dispatcher's voice came over the radio. A man had just called 911 in a panic. He said that he'd been on the phone with his girlfriend when she suddenly started screaming. The girlfriend's name was Nikki, and she was home with her 2 sons at 12 Clearview Drive in Safety Harbor. Deputy Ferguson switched on a siren and floored it towards the address. When he arrived, he knocked hard on the door. And to his surprise, a middle-aged man answered, looking very confused. Deputy Ferguson asked if someone named Nikki lived there, and the man said yes. The man called out Nikki's name, and a minute later, a teenage girl appeared. But to Ferguson, something just didn't feel right. Nothing about this scene matched the urgency or the information in that 911 call. Deputy Ferguson radioed dispatch and quickly realized there'd been a mistake. He was at the wrong house. The caller had given the wrong address, and it was just pure coincidence that there happened to be a Nikki there, too. The real location was 15 Clearview Drive, literally next door. This mistake meant Deputy Ferguson had lost precious minutes. He raced 30 feet over to the correct house, and the man from the wrong house followed right behind, because he knew Nikki Halpin's family. They were neighbors. The lights were on inside of Nikki's home, but when they knocked, no one answered. The neighbors started shouting for Nikki and Drew and Max, and eventually 2 faces appeared in the window next to the front door. It was the boys, but there was no sign of Nikki. The boys recognized their neighbor and opened the door. Deputy Ferguson immediately noticed blood spatter on Max's t-shirt. When he asked where their mother was, Drew pointed down the hall. Ferguson walked into the house and headed in the direction the boy had pointed. And moments later, he stepped into the bedroom. And there was Nikki. She lay motionless on the bed. The blankets around her were soaked with blood, and there were deep wounds on the left side of her head. It was instantly clear this was a crime scene. Ferguson realized the attacker could still be inside, so he shouted for Nikki's neighbor to take the boys back to his home and lock the doors. After that, he radioed for backup and began clearing the house on his own. Gun drawn, he went room by room, closet by closet, until he was sure that whoever had done this was already gone. It frustrated Deputy Ferguson to think that the time he'd wasted going to the wrong house might have made all the difference. It might have given Nikki's attacker the chance to slip away. Minutes later, an ambulance arrived, followed by a fleet of police cars. Nikki was actually still breathing, but barely. So paramedics airlifted her to a trauma center, fighting to keep her alive the whole way. Meanwhile, the evidence retrieval crew got to work processing the crime scene. The house was littered with toys and sports equipment, which made searching for fingerprints or DNA even more time-consuming than usual, so the team knew they were in for a long night. Shortly after midnight, 2 detectives arrived to take over the investigation for the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. Their names were Ed Judy and Robert Snipes, and they were both seasoned investigators with over a decade of experience under their belts. Judy and Snipes spoke to the officers processing the scene, who told them that, as of right now, Nikki was still clinging to life at the hospital. But based on what they'd seen, the chances she'd survive were slim. Whoever had attacked her appeared to have hit her in the head and upper body over and over again with something very heavy and blunt. But so far, the evidence retrieval crew had not found whatever that weapon was. In fact, they hadn't found much of anything. There was no evidence of a break-in or signs that anything had been stolen. But Detective Judy was not surprised. The viciousness of the attack did not feel like a robbery, and he was already beginning to suspect that the motive might be personal. After checking out the crime scene, Judy and Snipes left the house and headed next door to speak with Drew and Max, who were still with the neighbor. They tried to talk to the 9-year-old, Max, but he was completely unresponsive. Nikki's neighbor explained that Max had medical issues and rarely spoke, and now he may be traumatized too, and so that left 7-year-old Drew. The detectives sat Drew down in the kitchen, and as gently as they could, they asked him to tell them what he saw. There was a long silence, and at first, the detectives weren't sure the boy would even answer them. But then, he started talking. Drew told the detectives that he had been in the living room doing math problems when he heard his mother scream. He looked up and he saw her running down the hall, and there was this large man in dark clothes with a black mask on, carrying something long and shiny, maybe a metal baseball bat. He said his mother screamed for him to go hide, and then she disappeared into the bedroom, and the masked man followed her inside. Drew was so scared he couldn't move, but he followed his mother's instructions and he hid until he heard the attacker leave. At that point, he snuck out of his hiding place and ran into the bedroom, where he found his mother, unconscious, and his brother Max, cowering behind the bed. Drew took Max's hand and led him to the bathroom, where the brothers hid until they heard their neighbor's voice calling them from outside. When Drew finished telling this story, the detectives realized that the boys' ordeal was far worse than anyone realized. Max, the 9-year-old, had actually been in the bedroom with his mother while she was being attacked. By this point, it was nearing 2 a.m., and the boys were obviously exhausted. But Detective Judy had one more question. He asked Drew if he recognized the attacker. Now, Judy didn't expect much of an answer out of Drew, since the man had worn a mask. But to his surprise, Drew nodded and said yes. The boy looked right at Judy and said, "It was the man who knocks on the windows." On the drive back to the station, Detective Judy and Snipes talked over everything they'd learned, starting with Drew's final comment about the man who knocks on the windows. They had asked Drew what he meant, but the boy had not been able to explain beyond that. The detectives weren't sure if the man who knocks on the windows was a real clue or a garbled story from a deeply traumatized child. But whichever it was, they couldn't make sense of it right now. So they agreed to log the statement and come back to it later. For now, they decided to focus on the information from Drew that did sound reliable, and that was that the intruder was a man. This fact lined up both with their suspicions and with their training, which told them that whenever a woman is attacked, the culprit is usually an intimate partner. And so, in the detective's eyes, all the men in Nikki's life were now potential suspects. When the detectives got back to the station, Nikki's boyfriend, Chris, was waiting in an interview room to give a statement. Chris had been at his house talking to Nikki over the phone when he actually heard the attack. He was the one who actually made the 911 call. Logistically, it seemed hard to imagine how he could have done those two things if he had committed the attack himself. But at this point, Judy and Snipes weren't actually ruling anyone out. They knew Chris could have hired a hitman, for example, and there were a couple elements of Chris's story that raised questions. For example, they wanted to know why Chris gave dispatch the wrong address. The mix-up cost valuable time that possibly allowed Nikki's attacker to escape. And they also wanted to know, when Chris heard his girlfriend being attacked, why didn't he try to go to her house to check on her himself? He could have called 911 on the way from his cell phone. So the detectives sat down across from Chris and got right into it. Their first question, about the wrong address, Chris answered easily. He said he had been in a panic and simply mixed up the numbers. But the second question, about why he didn't do more to help Nikki, or at least go check on her, seemed to trip Chris up, and he kind of stumbled through a pretty confusing explanation. He said he had considered going to her house when he heard her scream on the phone, but he didn't because he was afraid that someone was waiting outside his own door and would attack him too if he tried to leave. To Judy and Snipes, this answer just seemed weird. There was no reason for Chris to think he would be targeted in some kind of coordinated two-pronged attack, and he hadn't mentioned it to the 911 dispatcher at all. It sounded like a pretty outlandish excuse. And so by the end of the interview, both Judy and Snipes were more skeptical of Chris than they had been when they walked in. But they still couldn't figure out a way for him to have been present for the attack while he was also home talking to Nikki on his landline phone. So despite having a few misgivings, they thanked Chris for his time and let him go. As soon as Chris was gone, Snipes called the hospital for an update on Nikki's status. It was now 3 a.m., 6 hours after the attack. Snipes was not expecting good news, so it came as a relief when the doctors told him that no, Nikki is actually still alive. Her vitals were stable, and it was looking more likely that she'd survive the night. Still, her doctors stressed that her condition was dire. After getting off the phone, Snipes shared the news with his partner, and then they got to work on their next task, contacting Nikki's family to fill them in and see if they knew anything useful. Unfortunately, a quick search told them that Nikki's parents and siblings were 1,300 miles away in Massachusetts, and this kind of news was just too serious to deliver over the phone. So they called up the nearest precinct and arranged for a local officer to drive out to her parents' place and talk to them in person. That local officer knocked on Nikki's parents' home right as the sun was coming up. Nikki's mother answered, looking confused and tired. When the officer told her about the attack on her daughter, she gasped and began crying. The officer reached out a hand, offering her support, but the mother gathered herself quickly and then looked up through her tears and told the officer she could guess who had done this: Nikki's ex-husband, Donald. To explain this, Nikki's mother told a story that stretched back a decade to 1994, in the early days of Nikki and Donald's marriage. That November, their oldest son Max was born with life-threatening complications. A buildup of fluid in his skull put too much pressure on his brain, and he only narrowly survived. Over the next few years, Max endured dozens of brain surgeries, and during one of those surgeries, a nurse accidentally gave him the wrong medication, and it nearly killed him. Nikki and Donald sued the hospital over the incident, kicking off a drawn-out and very expensive legal battle that created a lot of financial pressure on the family. These new money problems, along with Max's ongoing health issues, led to constant stress in their household, which eventually contributed to the collapse of Nikki and Donald's marriage. And then soon after their divorce was finalized, the hospital finally settled in the case, granting Max a trust fund of $1.5 million. And in the legal wrangling that followed, Nikki had become sole custodian of that fund, and Donald was shut out completely. He would never see a dime. This is why Nikki's mom thought Donald might have attacked her daughter. She believed that he simply harbored a grudge over the money. Detectives Judy and Snipes were already on their way to Donald's place when the Massachusetts officer who visited Nikki's mom called them to tell them about Donald's potential million-dollar motive. Now, Judy and Snipes already considered Donald a suspect simply because he was Nikki's ex-husband, but this new information shot him right to the top of their suspect list. They found Donald at home in his bachelor pad apartment, sitting down to coffee and the morning newspaper. When they told him that Nikki had been attacked last night and was in critical condition at the hospital, Donald looked at them in shock and then demanded to know where his kids were. The detectives calmly explained that the boys were perfectly safe, but they currently were in the custody of social services. They couldn't be released to Donald until the detectives were confident that he wasn't involved in the attack. Now, Judy and Snipes watched as Donald processed the fact that they were treating him like a suspect. He seemed surprised, and in a tight voice, he told them to come in and ask whatever they wanted. Inside, as Judy and Snipes launched into their questions, it quickly became clear that the divorce was a very sensitive topic for Donald, but not just because of that trust. He did say he did not think Nikki was managing the fund properly, but beyond that, he told the detectives that actually, he was still in love with Nikki. But this admission really only made Donald even more attractive as a suspect. Maybe, the detectives thought, he was jealous that Nikki was dating other people. So they asked Donald if he would come back to the station for a polygraph test, and he said yes. Detectives Judy and Snipes were hoping to use this polygraph test to press Donald about whether he really still loved Nikki or if his love had turned to anger. They wanted to try to catch him in a lie. But as soon as they got the machine up and running, Donald started passing question after question without so much as a blip. The detectives started to wonder if maybe they and Nikki's family had misjudged Donald. But then it happened. Judy asked Donald if he knew who hurt Nikki. Donald said no, and the machine registered a sharp rise in his heartbeat. This signified a possible lie. Snipes felt a rush of exhilaration, but he didn't mention anything about it until the test was done. When it was done, he confronted Donald about the question he'd failed. Donald took a long time to respond, and when he finally did, he said that he hadn't lied. He really didn't know who hurt Nikki. But if he was being totally transparent, he did suspect someone. He hadn't said anything until now because he didn't want to point fingers without any evidence. But if the detectives really wanted to know his opinion, Donald thought they should look into Dan Welch, the young, fit HVAC repairman Nikki dated after their separation. To both Judy and Snipes, Donald's accusation against Dan Welch just seemed like a desperate attempt to divert attention away from him. But then Donald explained why he suspected Dan, and it was surprisingly convincing. Donald said that Nikki actually used to vent to him all the time about Dan. At first, she'd been really into their relationship, but when she began talking about marriage, Dan apparently wasn't interested, so Nikki had dumped him. But after she dumped him, Donald said that Nikki had told him it was like a switch had flipped. Dan was devastated. He refused to accept that it was over and kept calling Nikki and begging her to take him back for months afterward. Eventually, Nikki turned to Donald for advice, and he told her to take out a restraining order. When Judy and Snipes finished their interview with Donald, they still weren't convinced he was innocent. However, they now had a second suspect, Dan Welch. The first thing Judy and Snipes did as they began digging into Dan was to search for that restraining order that Donald apparently had told Nikki to file. But there wasn't one. Not only had Nikki not taken out a restraining order against Dan, but nobody had. In fact, Dan had no criminal record of any kind. And the more Judy and Snipes thought about it, the more they realized that what Donald told them about Dan just didn't add up. Dan Welch had gotten himself dumped for not wanting to marry Nikki, while Donald fully admitted that he himself was still in love with her. And that was quite a motive. But before they could make any final judgments, they needed to talk to Dan. But that interview would have to wait. It was now late in the afternoon on the day after Nikki's attack. Detectives Judy and Snipes had been up for more than 24 hours working this case, and they were fading fast. Before they spoke to any more suspects, they needed to get some sleep. The pair reconvened the next morning at the station, and the first thing they did was call the hospital to check on Nikki. And unfortunately, the news was bad. She'd spent 36 hours on life support, she was unconscious, and showing no signs of brain activity. It was unlikely she was ever going to recover. This put the detectives in a somber mood as they headed out to talk to Nikki's ex-boyfriend, Dan. Dan lived in Clearwater, just a few miles away from Nikki's home in Safety Harbor. Judy and Snipes wanted to catch him off guard, so they didn't call ahead before they knocked on his door. When Dan answered, the detectives studied his face as they told him they were here to speak about Nikki. They deliberately did not tell him why, because they wanted to see if the mention of Nikki made him nervous, or angry, or emotional in any way. But Dan just stared at them, like he couldn't understand what they were saying. In fact, he was acting like he didn't even know who Nikki was. So when Dan just continued to look confused, the detectives repeated themselves, this time using Nikki's full name. And that's when a look of recognition passed over Dan's face. He quickly waved them inside and said he'd been confused because he always called Nikki Nicole. Dan said he had heard about the attack on the radio and had been expecting a visit. As they walked to his living room, Dan kept saying how he was happy to help the investigation. But to the detectives, he seemed almost too eager. Dan's upbeat demeanor felt forced, and Judy and Snipes could sense anxiety just beneath the surface. They had barely sat down when Dan had already offered to provide DNA samples and invited the detectives to search his apartment for evidence. The detectives told Dan that yes, they would love to do both of those things, but first, they just wanted to talk. They told him that they had heard his breakup with Nikki might have gotten a bit ugly, and so they wanted to hear his side of the story. If there was any truth to Donald's accusations about Dan harassing Nikki following the breakup, the detectives thought this question might trigger some sort of reaction. But Dan just sort of shrugged it off. He said he had gotten over Nicole a long time ago, and he was now seeing somebody else. Dan also had an alibi for the night of the attack. He said he had spent the evening working out with a buddy and then went home around 10 p.m., and then he called his girlfriend. Dan pulled up contact information for both of those people and gave it to Judy and Snipes. At this point, the detectives weren't sure what to think of Dan. They figured his alibi would check out. Otherwise, Dan would not have volunteered it. So maybe Dan's anxiety they were sensing was just regular anxiety. I mean, plenty of totally innocent people get nervous around cops and often kind of over-explain themselves like Dan was doing. It didn't necessarily mean he was hiding something. But just to be safe, Judy asked Dan if he'd be willing to come to the station to take a polygraph. And like Judy expected, Dan said yes. When they got back to the station, they set Dan up in a private room and hooked him up to the polygraph machine. Dan said he was ready, so Judy began asking questions, with Snipes watching the monitor for signs of emotional distress. And pretty much right away, Snipes saw the needle spike. That meant Dan was hiding something. According to the machine, he was lying. But as Judy asked another question and another, something weird began to happen. Every question, even baseline questions about what day of the week it was, the machine would mark Dan's response as a possible lie. And with these kinds of results, it was hard to know if Dan was actually lying or if he was just so anxious that basically anything he said was setting off the machine. The detectives both knew that even in the best cases, polygraph tests are not perfect. The fact that Dan was failing so badly definitely raised their suspicions of him, but it wasn't a reason to hold or charge him. So after asking him the remainder of the questions, which Dan basically failed entirely, they had no choice but to let him go. That evening, Judy and Snipes talked through the case, weighing their potential suspects. They had now spoken to the last 3 men in Nikki's life. First, there was Chris, Nikki's current boyfriend. His explanation about not rushing to help Nikki because he thought he might be in danger, because there was somebody outside his door, still struck them as extremely weird. But the fact that he had called 911 as the attack was ongoing made it hard to see him as the culprit. They still hadn't ruled him out completely, but he was admittedly less suspicious than their other 2 suspects. Next, there was Donald, Nikki's ex-husband. And of all 3 suspects, he had the strongest motive, since with Nikki out of the way, he would not only get custody of their kids, but also control of $1 million trust. And the fact that he had pointed the finger at Dan, Nikki's ex-boyfriend, was also suspicious, especially since there was no criminal record of the problems Donald had told them about. That on its own was almost enough to convince them that Donald was their guy, he was guilty. Except that their third suspect, Dan, the ex-boyfriend, had failed every question on his polygraph test. All in all, the detectives agreed that it was still too early to draw any firm conclusions. Just 2 days had passed since the attack, and so far, the investigation had been moving at a breakneck pace. Judy and Snipes felt good about how much they'd learned already, but didn't want to miss an important clue by rushing things. They would continue interviewing Nikki's family and friends, while keeping a particularly close eye on Dan and Donald. Those 2 they were the most suspicious of, and they figured if one of them was guilty, hopefully they would slip up and do something to give themselves away. The next day was January 11th. 3 days had passed since the attack, and incredibly, Nikki was still clinging to life. However, that morning, her doctors told her family that she would never wake up. So, Nikki's family said their final goodbyes at the hospital, then doctors turned off the machines that were keeping her alive. Nikki died shortly afterwards. And so that meant that Judy and Snipes were now officially dealing with a homicide case. Also, Nikki's death started a ticking clock on the custody of her sons. Drew and Max were still in social services because Judy and Snipes considered their father, Donald, a suspect. But that couldn't continue indefinitely. If the detectives didn't charge Donald soon, the boys would be released into his care, and Donald would take control of Max's $1 million trust. Over the next few days, Judy and Snipes continued interviewing Nikki's friends and colleagues, but they didn't come up with much new information. The only interesting tidbit came from a friend of Nikki, and it didn't help the detectives narrow things down at all. This friend said she thought the killer could be Chris, who was Nikki's most recent boyfriend, and the one who had called 911 during the attack. This friend said that Chris was jealous, and the couple argued all the time. And so all this left Judy and Snipes in a tough spot. They had lots of suspicions, but no hard evidence against anyone. A week passed, then another, with no significant new leads, and the detectives started to worry that their case was about to go cold. On February 16th, just over a month after Nikki's death, an office assistant at the sheriff's department was transcribing audio files from the case as part of the standard bookkeeping process. The case was approaching a dead end, and she was responsible for filing everything away properly. This assistant had already processed the dozens of hours of police interviews with Donald, Dan, and Chris, and she was nearly done. The last file on her list was the actual 911 call Chris had made on the night of the attack, January 8th. The assistant didn't expect it to take long, but when she put on her headphones and hit play, she heard something on this call that made her jump out of her chair. She had to stop and rewind the tape, going back to the start over and over again, just to make sure she wasn't hearing things. The audio was garbled, and it was hard to tell what was actually going on, but after a few listens, she was sure. It was not her imagination. The sound she had heard was definitely there, just buried under multiple layers of distortion. So the assistant dashed down the hall to Detective Judy's office and played the file for him and Snipes. At first, the detectives couldn't understand what she was so excited about, but then the assistant adjusted the levels a bit and played the call again. This time, through the crackly static, Judy and Snipes heard what she was talking about. Just like that, they knew exactly who killed Nikki Halpin. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene, interviews conducted throughout the investigation, and the recording of the 911 call, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Nikki Halpin on the night of January 8, 2004. The house at 15 Clearview Drive, Safety Harbor, was silent and empty when, at approximately 9:30 p.m., the killer rode up on a bike. They stashed their bike out of view beside the garage and then looked around quickly to make sure nobody was walking past. Then, satisfied they were alone, the killer lifted the garage door up maybe a foot or so and rolled underneath. Once the killer was inside, they began to rifle through their backpack. They pulled out a mask and put it on. Then they took out a heavy silver flashlight, so large that at a glance, it almost looked like a metal baseball bat. Then, with the flashlight in hand, the killer walked from the garage into the house itself. Within moments, the killer was creeping through the quiet house down the hall. They headed to Nikki's office, where they switched on the computer. When the screen lit up, the instant messenger app was already open, and Nikki's conversation with Chris was visible on the screen. Just then, the icon beside Chris's handle changed colors, indicating that he was now online. The killer thought for a moment, and then hit a couple of keys at random and hit enter. A few seconds later, a response came through from Chris. "How'd you get home so fast? You must have run every red light." As the killer read that, they smiled. Now, they knew Nikki was on her way home. Killer switched off the computer screen and walked into a different room and hid. A few minutes later, the killer heard the front door open, followed by the sounds of Drew and Max running happily into the house. The killer stayed where they were, thinking Nikki would soon pass by. But the wait took longer than they expected. And so as the minutes ticked by, the killer grew impatient. And so eventually they poked their head out of the room where they were hiding, and right then they heard Nikki talking to someone in the hall. It sounded like she was on the phone, and she was saying something about an intruder in the house. With a sudden pang of horror, the killer realized their mistake. Nikki must have gone into her office. She had seen the message and realized someone had sent it from her computer when she was still gone. There was no more time to wait. The killer sprinted into the hall, where Nikki turned around, saw them, and screamed. The sound filled the killer with a blinding rage, and they shouted right back at her, "Nicole, calm down!" But Nikki didn't calm down. She turned and ran. And as she passed by the living room, she shouted for Drew to hide, and then continued into the bedroom to try to help Max hide. But the killer chased after her and grabbed her and threw her onto the bed. She screamed and tried to fight them off, but the killer swung that heavy flashlight as hard as they could into her head and her shoulders and her neck over and over until she stopped moving. The killer completely ignored Max, the 9-year-old who was right next to the bed, cowering, who had just watched this happen to his mother. The killer simply turned, dashed out of the room, taking the bloody flashlight with them. However, what the killer failed to notice was the phone lying on the bed beside Nikki's limp body. The line was still open, and on the other end, Chris was listening over speakerphone while he spoke to the police on his cell phone. And so with Chris's phones so close together, the audio from Nikki's room was picked up and recorded along the 911 call. It was very faint and heavily degraded, but with a little effort, the phrase, "Nicole, calm down," could be heard in the background. And this was the phrase that blew the investigation wide open. When the sheriff's department assistant had heard those words, she instantly recognized the killer's voice, since she'd just transcribed hours of interrogation videos with them. But it wasn't just the voice that gave the killer away. One word caught on that tape sealed the killer's fate. Every single person in her life called her Nikki. Every person except for one. Only Nikki's ex-boyfriend, Dan Welch, the HVAC guy, called her Nicole. It was his voice on the recording. His voice saying, "Nicole, calm down." right before he struck her with the flashlight in front of her own kids. It would turn out that Nikki's ex-husband, Donald, had been telling the truth when he said Dan was harassing Nikki. Ever since their breakup, Dan had been stalking Nikki, showing up at her house without warning and pounding on the windows while shouting for her to come out and talk. And this fact likely explains the strange way Nikki's son Drew had described his mother's killer. To a child, Dan was the man who knocks on the windows. Dan was indicted in January of 2006 and eventually pled guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison and will be eligible for parole in 2028. In 1937, the Japanese declared war on China and invaded their country. The United States, who was friends with China, initially did not intervene in fear of provoking Japan. But after the Japanese murdered hundreds of thousands of unarmed Chinese civilians and the Japanese attacked an American warship, the United States was forced to step in. American officials responded to the Japanese aggression by placing serious economic sanctions and trade embargoes on Japan, believing this would cripple their war efforts in China, causing them to have to retreat. However, the sanctions and embargoes did not have this effect. Instead, they just angered Japan and made them even more determined to hold their ground in China. Over the next few years, the United States and Japan attempted to negotiate some sort of settlement, but neither side would make any concessions, and so neither side would budge. A few years later, on the morning of Sunday, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise aerial attack on the American military base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. After the 2-hour attack was done, over 2,400 Americans were killed, with another 1,000 wounded, and 300 airplanes and 20 ships were either destroyed or significantly crippled. The Japanese had hoped this attack would goad the United States into lifting the sanctions and embargoes they had placed on them from back in 1937. But instead, all the Japanese did was goad the United States into all-out war with them. One day after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States officially declared war on Japan, thus entering World War II. On the day the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, Jack Lucas, like every other American in the country, was glued to his radio listening to the news. He was devastated and shocked at this carnage he was hearing about in Hawaii. And so by the time the President of the United States was declaring war on Japan, Jack had already made up his mind that he was going to join up and he was going to fight for his country. However, there was an issue. Jack wasn't old enough to join the military. You needed to be 17 years old, and Jack was only 14. But this was not going to stop Jack. So he created this fake document that said he was 17 years old, and he forged his mother's signature on it. And then, after bribing him, he got a notary to sign off on this document as well. And so Jack took his forged documentation, he gave it to the recruiter, and before long, Jack was accepted into the armed services and was on his way to Marine Corps boot camp. After completing initial training and becoming a Marine, the Marines found out Jack's paperwork was actually faked. But instead of kicking him out of the military, they said, "Jack, you can stay in, but under one condition. You can't go overseas to combat. You have to stay in the United States. You can drive a truck and help out around here, but you can't deploy and go to war until you're of age." Jack was not happy about this, but initially he did as he was told, and he did just drive a truck around and support it as best as he could. But after about 1.5 to 2 years of this, Jack just couldn't do it anymore. That was not why he had forged this document to get into the military. He had done that so he could actually go fight in the war. And so finally, when he was just 16 years old, he abandoned his post and snuck onto the back car of a troop transport train that was going to another military base. And so when he arrived at this base, which was in California, he hopped off and then ran to the docks where there were these big warships. And he saw one of them, there was a whole bunch of troops loading onto it. And he figured, that's where I need to go. And so he snuck onto the ship and he hid down below. And then after the ship took off and was out to sea, he revealed himself. And he walked up to a Marine officer and he kind of played off the, I must have got on the wrong ship, but now that I'm here, can I join your unit? And this officer, who had no idea how young Jack was, eventually said, "Okay, but prepare yourself because we're going to invade Iwo Jima." Now, Jack had never heard of Iwo Jima and did not know its significance. But frankly, Jack didn't really care. He was just glad that he was actually going to see combat. What Jack couldn't have known, and what the other Marines on the ship couldn't have known either, is that the battle for Iwo Jima would become one of the bloodiest and deadliest battles of the entire war. The Japanese that were on this island defending it were absolutely fearless and would not surrender despite being outnumbered, and they were heavily entrenched in these caves and tunnels built in all over the island, and they rarely left these caves and tunnels. Which meant Jack and the other Marines, when they landed on this island, the only way they could fight the Japanese was by literally crawling down into these tunnels, which were usually booby-trapped, and fighting up close and personal with the enemy. Jack's ship arrived off the coast of Iwo Jima in February of 1945 when Jack was still 16 years old. On February 19th, the first wave of Marines climbed down the side of this big ship down onto these smaller amphibious landing crafts, and then one by one they began making their way towards Iwo Jima to begin the invasion. Jack was not part of this initial invasion. He would be going out on day 2 with the second wave of Marines. And so Jack and all the other second wave Marines just stood at the front of the ship and watched as these amphibious crafts made it up to the beach and then just got completely gunned down by Japanese machine gunners that were lining the beach. And so by the second day, when Jack and the rest of the Marines are getting ready to launch their assault, there are literally thousands of dead Americans just lining the beach. But Jack and the other second wave Marines, they knew this was their job, this was their duty, and so they were undeterred. They climbed down the side of the ship, they boarded their amphibious landing craft, and began the journey towards the island. As they got closer, the Japanese machine gunners opened fire not only on Jack and the boat he was in, but all of the crews that were coming towards the beach. And so hundreds of Americans were just getting gunned down before they even reached the sand. Jack and his crew managed to get to the beach, and so as the gate dropped on their boat, and as Jack is running onto the beach, the men around him are just getting cut to pieces by these machine guns. Jack manages not to get shot, and he, along with 3 other Marines, run up the beach and they lay down in front of the sand dune that protected them from these machine gunners. Jack knew he couldn't stay there for very long because the Japanese were also firing artillery shells onto the beach, and so it would just be a matter of time before he was blown up. And so Jack and these other 3 Marines that had arrived at the same time, they began moving north, doing their best not to get shot or blown up, stopping behind rocks and trees and jumping behind sand dunes. And after a couple hours of doing this, the 4 of them reached the airfield at the northern end of the island. And when they get there, a machine gunner inside of a pillbox is like a small concrete fort that only has openings on 3 or 4 of its sides that are just big enough for a machine gun to poke through. A machine gunner inside one of these pillboxes notices Jack and the other 3 Marines, and they open fire on them. And somehow, Jack and these other 3 Marines managed to not get shot, and were able to maneuver and then fire through one of those openings and take out the machine gunner inside. And so now that this gunner is down, Jack and the others see the opportunity to run forward and take more ground of this airfield. And as they're running, other Japanese soldiers in the general vicinity, they see them, they start opening up on them from other pillboxes and other locations, and it forces Jack and these Marines to just jump into the nearest trench to avoid getting shot. And so they're jumping into a Japanese trench, which is a deep hole dug in the ground to protect yourself from getting shot. And as they jump in there, they're expecting to see Japanese soldiers coming towards them, but there weren't any soldiers. But they knew they couldn't stay there for very long because eventually Japanese soldiers would come through here and then they'd get killed. And so they quickly decided their best bet was to basically get out of this trench and run towards the pillbox where they knew they had taken out the machine gunner inside, so they could actually take that pillbox for themselves. And so their plan was they would run towards it and stop inside of each of the trenches along the way to protect themselves because they know there are other Japanese that know where they are. And then once they get to the pillbox, they can regroup and call in reinforcements. And so one of the men Jack was with said, okay, I'll go first. And so he climbs out of his trench as the Japanese are shooting at him, and he sprints about 10 or 15 feet until he gets to the next trench on the way to this pillbox. And so Jack is watching as this guy jumps into this trench, and as soon as he disappears out of view, this Marine is immediately turning around and scrambling to get back out of the trench, and he's trying to run back towards Jack and the other two Marines he was with. It would turn out this guy had jumped into another Japanese trench that was full of Japanese soldiers. He'd actually landed on top of an actual soldier. But these Japanese soldiers were so caught off guard by this, they didn't have time to react and shoot this Marine before the Marine was able to scramble out and get back to Jack and the others. And then for the next several minutes, Jack and these other three Marines opened fire on these Japanese soldiers in this trench like 10 or 15 feet away. And these Japanese soldiers, they too opened fire on Jack and the other three. Jack was able to take out two of the Japanese soldiers before his gun jammed. And so he ducked down into the trench to work on his gun. And as he's down there, he notices there are two grenades on the ground right next to him. And so without any hesitation, he yells, "Grenade!" to the other Marines, and then he jumps on top of them, smothering the grenades with his body. One of the grenades was a dud, and so it didn't explode. The other was not a dud, and it went off. The way a grenade works is there is a small piece of explosive that is inside of metal housing that's usually spherical, and this metal housing is the thing you actually hold on to and throw when you throw a grenade. And so when this small explosive is triggered by pulling the pin and releasing the spoon, it detonates and it causes the metal housing itself to be ripped apart and sent flying. Basically, when a grenade goes off, it's like having hundreds of pieces of jagged metal shot off in every direction that are all traveling roughly at the speed of a bullet or faster. And so naturally, a grenade up close is incredibly lethal. In fact, the kill radius of a typical fragmentation grenade is about 5 meters. When the grenade under Jack that was not a dud exploded, it sent Jack flying into the air, and then when he came back down again, his comrades saw him and they could see he was clearly devastated from all the fragmentation that had been pumped into his body, and so they assumed he was dead. But even if they thought he was alive for some reason, there was nothing they could have done to have helped him, because they were actively being engaged by dozens of Japanese soldiers that were only about 10 or 15 feet away. And so eventually, these three other Marines that Jack had just saved were forced to leave Jack where he was and retreat back to the beach, and they would all live. The Japanese soldiers in the trench that they were fighting against would eventually come into Jack's trench, but most likely when they saw Jack laying there just completely ruined from this grenade, they assumed he was dead, and so they just kind of left him there. But Jack wasn't dead. He just couldn't speak, and he couldn't see anything, and he really couldn't move, although he could wiggle a few fingers on his left hand. And so for hours, as he lay there in agonizing pain, in and out of consciousness, he just wiggled the fingers on his left hand, hoping an American would see him and know he was still alive. And you gotta figure, this whole time, it is just constant chaos all around him. His chances of survival are incredibly slim. The idea that an American is going to find him and be able to evacuate him is almost zero, and he must have known that. But by some miracle, eventually another American unit did find their way into Jack's trench, and they did notice him wiggling the fingers on his left hand. And so they were able to evacuate him from the trench down to the beach, and from there, under the cover of darkness, they were able to bring him out to a hospital boat offshore. And there he would begin the first of 26 major surgeries to remove the grenade shrapnel from his torso, his arm, and his face. Despite his grievous injuries, Jack would surprisingly make a full recovery. And 8 months after his injury, the President of the United States would award him the highest decoration for bravery, the Medal of Honor. He would be the youngest recipient of this award since the 1800s, and to this day, he is one of only a handful of miners to have won this award. Following his departure from the military, Jack would survive a near-death experience while skydiving when both of his parachutes, his main and his reserve, failed, and he just smashed into the ground, but somehow lived. He would also survive a very bad house fire, and he would survive an assassination attempt on his life by his ex-wife. And so naturally, he titled his memoir Indestructible. Jack would eventually die of natural causes on June 5th, 2008. He was 80 years old. Our next and final story is called Just a Knife. Born in South Texas in 1935, Roy Benavidez was orphaned as a young child and sent to live with his uncle. As a young teen, he had to drop out of school to work in the beet and cotton fields just to help support his family. When he turned 18, he decided he wanted to get away from his hometown and do something bigger with his life, and so he enlisted in the Army, and shortly after that, he went to airborne school and then was assigned to the very famous 82nd Airborne Division. In October of 1964, Roy was a part of the first 125,000 Americans sent to Vietnam. While on a classified operation that required Roy to dress up as an enemy combatant, he stepped on a landmine in the middle of the jungle and nobody else was with him, so he's totally stranded. But fortunately, a squad of U.S. Marines came upon him, but from what he was wearing, they assumed he was an enemy soldier, and so they almost walked past him, but someone thought to just flip him over and see who he was, and they discovered he was American, and he had American dog tags on. And so he was evacuated from Vietnam and sent to an American hospital, and there, a doctor would tell him that he had a serious spinal injury and that it was unlikely he would ever walk again. And Roy's first reaction was, please don't discharge me from the Army. Because for Roy, the Army was his life. It was all he had. He was incredibly proud of it. And he desperately wanted to go back to Vietnam. And so he pleaded with the doctors and the nurses, please let me have some time to try to regain my strength in my legs so that I don't get medically discharged. And so they said, look, you're going to get medically retired if you aren't walking within the year. And so every night when his doctors and nurses would leave, he would fall out of his bed and then drag himself across the ground to the wall. And then he'd pull himself up and try to put weight on his legs and attempt to build strength back up and retrain himself how to walk. And after 6 months of doing this every night, he did literally reteach himself how to walk. He built up strength in his legs, and his doctors and nurses, they're watching this transformation during the day, but they're not seeing him at night. And they're telling him, this is a miracle. We've never seen this before. We've never seen someone recover so quickly. And Roy just stayed quiet because he wanted to make sure he was allowed to keep doing that every night. And so finally, after those 6 months, his doctors and nurses agreed that, yep, he's good. He can stay in the Army. But the Army said they wanted him to take a desk job because he had already been so badly wounded in combat. And Roy didn't want that. He pleaded with them to let him go back to the 82nd, but they said, no, we're not going to risk you getting hurt again. And so he was sent to North Carolina for his desk job. And as soon as he got there, he began training like a maniac every minute of every day, trying to get in the best shape of his life. Because his plan in his head was once he got there, he would try out for Special Forces. He would try to become an Army Green Beret, which is the premier combat unit in the Army. It's one of the hardest ones to get into. And their training program is in North Carolina. And so after a few months, he was in amazing shape and he asked his superiors, can I go try out to be a Green Beret? And they're like, I can't believe you're even walking, but you know what? You've come this far, you can go try out. And just a couple of months later, Roy Benavidez was a Green Beret. A year later, in 1968, so 4 years after Roy was nearly killed by that landmine, he was sent back to Vietnam for his second combat tour. And as soon as he got there, the fighting was very intense. On May 2nd of that year, Roy had a day off, and he was spending his day off at a church service inside of their wooden shack they had built on their base. And while he was in there listening to the chaplain, he heard a radio call come out from the communications table that was just outside of the shack he was in, and it sounded like someone was in trouble. And so he ran outside to listen to the radio, and what he heard was this very desperate call from someone yelling into the radio, get us out of here. And in the background of this radio call is just a constant barrage of gunfire. The call for help came from a 12-man Army Special Forces team that had been ambushed by an entire North Vietnamese Army infantry battalion. To put that in perspective, that is 12 Special Forces members, of which many of them Roy knew personally, in the middle of the jungle, where on all four sides there are over 1,000 enemy combatants. As Roy is hearing this distressing transmission come across the radio, he hears overhead the sound of incoming helicopters. And he looks and he sees there's 3 birds that are coming towards their base. And so he runs over to the landing zone to greet the helicopters as they come in, and he can see as they're landing, they are all completely covered in bullet holes. And as soon as they touch down, Roy runs up to one of the door gunners, which is this 19-year-old kid, and he looks kind of dazed. And Roy asks him, what's going on? Where'd you guys just come from? Were you out there at that ambush site? Do you know what's going on with that 12-man team? and the door gunner just collapses into Roy's arms and dies. He had been shot up. These 3 helicopters had attempted previously to fly into the jungle and save that 12-man team, but they had been shot off and had been unsuccessful. Roy helped get the dead door gunner out of the helo, and then he turned to the pilot of this helo where the door gunner was, and he asked him, are you going to go back out there and try to save those guys? And the pilot was obviously so distraught about the death of his door gunner, and also the fact that there are 12 men out there that they could not rescue, that he's chomping at the bit. He wants to go back out there. And Roy immediately volunteers, hops in the helo, and they head out to go rescue this 12-man team. So not only are there only 2 of them, but Roy was so eager to volunteer himself, he forgot his gun. So all he had on him was his knife and some medical supplies. But nonetheless, the pilot just keeps flying towards the ambush site, which was in Cambodia. It was this really dense stretch of jungle. And as they got closer and closer, gunfire started coming out of the jungle towards the helicopter. And so the pilot had to do this kind of constant zigzagging just to avoid getting shot down. And so as they're zigzagging, they notice there's some smoke coming out of the jungle. And it was very clear that this 12-man team is trying to signal to the helo, here we are, come get us, because they can hear the helicopters coming in. And so the pilot tried to fly down and get as close as he could, but anytime he got even marginally close to this team, the rate of fire would pick up so dramatically that the helo was just about to get shot down. And so the pilot began to turn away, and he told Roy, we can't get any closer. We're going to have to get more people in here. And Roy just tells him, no, get as low as you can, and I will jump out into the jungle. And the pilot turns to him, and he's like, you can't do that. You're going to get killed. And Roy somehow convinces this pilot that he alone, without a gun, is totally competent. Just put me down in that jungle and everything's going to be just fine. And so the pilot said, okay. And he lowered right over the canopy of this jungle, about 100 yards away from where this 12-man team is trapped. And without any hesitation, Roy just leaps off the helicopter into the jungle. Now, you got to understand that where he was jumping was where the enemy was. He was literally jumping, no parachute, no gun, no anything, just crashing through the canopy onto the jungle floor where he'll definitely be surrounded by enemy combatants. And so he plummets through the canopy, he smashes onto the ground, he pops up and just starts running through the jungle with enemies on either side of him towards the 12-man down team. And the enemy was so surprised to just see this American running through the middle of the jungle by himself with no weapon that they hesitated for a minute and they didn't open fire on him. But when they did open fire, Roy got shot in the face, in the back of the head, in the leg. They threw a grenade that detonated at his back and sent shrapnel into him. But none of it stopped Roy. He just kept on running until he made it to this downed 12-man team. And when he got to them, they were in terrible shape. They were doing their best to stay behind some trees, but rounds were coming in from all directions, and 4 of them were already dead, and the others that were still alive were critically wounded. In fact, one of the most able-bodied of the surviving 12 had been shot in the head and was missing an eye and could barely see out of the other one. And so he's fighting to stay conscious and he's generally trying to shoot in one direction. But I mean, that's their best guy at this point, to give you a state of how they were doing. But Roy ran up to this guy, he pulled him down, he gave him a shot of morphine in the arm, and he repositioned him because he couldn't really see, and told him where to shoot his gun. And then, under a constant hail of bullets, Roy low-crawled to each of the other living team members and gave them morphine shots, and then began dragging each and every one of them away from the ambush site to this other area where there was better cover, and there was a nearby clearing that he believed a helicopter could land in if the pilot was really daring. On one of Roy's last trips back to the ambush site to get the last few surviving members, he saw 2 other men that were part of this team that had been totally cut off from the main group. And when Roy had jumped into the jungle and ran in, all his adrenaline had kicked up and he just hadn't done a head count. And so he didn't realize there were 2 other people over there. And so without any hesitation, he grabbed a gun off of one of the dead enemy soldiers and just began running towards this down 2-man team. And as he's running, he's shooting wildly in every direction, trying his best to suppress enemy fire, but it's really doing nothing. He's just dodging bullets as he's running. And right as he got close to the 2-man team, a bullet went flying through his thigh, just clean through his thigh, and it didn't slow him down. He got to the 2-man team totally unfazed, and he says, okay, get ready to move. He stands back up and he starts shooting again in both directions and tells them to crawl back to the main unit. And so he stands up and continues to shoot in both directions until these two men get back over to the main group. Once they were safely with the group, Roy again ran the gauntlet with this huge gaping hole in his thigh all the way back to the main group. And so now that Roy had a full head count of all of the living members of the downed 12-man team, and he had moved them all to this slightly safer area relatively with better cover and concealment, he threw a smoke grenade into the nearby clearing he had found in hopes that the helo pilot overhead would see the smoke and be willing to come down and land. The pilot that had dropped off Roy had not actually left the area. He had moved away from all the fighting, but he was loitering in case something like this happened. And so he saw the smoke, and without any hesitation, he flew right over, taking rounds the whole time, pinging off the side of his helicopter, and he touched down right in this tiny little clearing. And so as these semi-able-bodied surviving members of this unit begin making their way over to the helicopter, Roy began running around a little ways off from the helicopter, picking up rifles off of the dead enemy and shooting back at the enemy, dropping that gun, running over, picking up another one, engaging the enemy over and over again, doing everything he can to try to protect the extract of his men behind him. And once Roy turned around and saw most of the men had made it onto the helicopter, Roy believed it was his chance now to run out and try to collect some of their dead teammates. And so Roy just takes off into the jungle, right into enemy fire. He's got two guns in his hands, and he's running. He's trying to engage the enemy as he's going, and then he comes across the first of his dead teammates, and it happens to be one of his very best friends, a man named Leroy Wright. And so he grabs Leroy and begins trying to haul him back towards the chopper, and as he's moving, Roy gets shot again, this time through his stomach. So he tries to keep himself on his feet, and as he's doing that, a grenade detonates behind him, sending more shrapnel into his body, knocking him unconscious. When he came to, he started looking around, and he could see in the tree line dozens of enemy soldiers running towards him. And so he knew if he tried to bring Leroy back to the chopper, that was a suicide mission. And so he had to leave his friend behind. He jumped up, and with all of these enemy combatants just constantly engaging him, he ran all the way back, zigging and zagging back to the main group. And when he got there, expecting to see the helicopter, he found the helicopter had actually crashed onto the ground and was on fire. It had been shot down while he was unconscious. And so he ran over to the flaming shell of this helicopter, and he saw the pilot had been killed, but some of the men that had climbed on, the men that he had just rescued, they had survived the crash and subsequent explosion. And so Roy just leaps into the burning vehicle and starts throwing these survivors out. Then he leapt back out, he picked up a gun, continued to engage the enemy, and then began picking up these wounded men and dragging them even farther away to another area that was safely away from this crash site. Because he knew if he didn't get all these people away from the crash site, pretty soon mortars are going to come raining down on this area, because their enemy is going to want to kill any of the people that are going to try to rescue the people that were on the helicopter. And so Roy finally gets all of the survivors over to this new area, and he's looking around, and he can see there are still hundreds of enemy fighters that are not that far away from them, just constantly engaging them. And Roy's doing his best to grab guns off the ground and shoot the enemy, but there's just too many of them. And he's looking around at his team, and everybody's on the brink of death. And so is Roy. He's just functioning on adrenaline at this point, and he thinks to himself, the only way we can get out of this is if we call in what's called a danger close airstrike. So what you need to understand about how airstrikes work in a combat zone is there's someone called a controller that is on the ground directing the aircraft overhead. They're the ones effectively telling the plane where to shoot. And so a danger close airstrike is when the controller tells the aircraft overhead, I want you to drop a bomb right here, giving them the grid coordinates, but where they're telling them to drop is basically in the same position where the controller is. You'd only do it if you're being overrun. It's a way to ensure your enemy gets taken out, even if that means taking yourself out. Now, the goal of the controller is not to drop the bomb on themselves or their team. The goal of the controller is to get that airstrike as close as you can to your position without killing you. And so Roy, who's physically wrecked, he's getting shot at, he's got bullet holes all over him, it's totally chaotic. He pulls out his map, he calmly finds his grid coordinates, he calls it into the aircraft overhead, and he calls in a beautiful precision napalm strike that does not affect his team at all. He calls in multiple gun runs. None of them affect his team, despite them all being considered danger close airstrikes. And so Roy just continuously called in attack run after attack run, taking out enemy combatants all around them, completely suppressing the fire. But at some point, the aircraft overhead ran out of fuel and had to leave. And at that point, the surviving enemy combatants, which still numbered in the hundreds, they popped their heads up and they unleashed a hellacious volley of fire in which Roy again got shot clean through the leg. And so now Roy's looking around and he's realizing they're pretty much out of options. They don't have aircraft overhead. Roy's basically out of ammunition and there's no dead guys' guns around for him to grab. All of his team members are basically on the brink of death. And so Roy's thinking to himself, any minute now, we're going to get overrun. And so he crawls to each of his surviving teammates and he gives them one last shot of morphine to at least make their death painless. And then at the 11th hour, another helo comes blazing into the jungle and opens fire on the enemy, pushing them back. Roy is immediately invigorated and motivated because now he sees an opportunity to potentially survive this. And so once again, he grabs his teammates and begins schlepping them over to the helicopter. And after he believed he got the last of them on board, he turned and saw two of his teammates had fallen down farther back in the jungle and the enemy was closing in on them. And so Roy, like always, without any hesitation, just starts running towards them. And as he's just about to reach them, an enemy soldier that had apparently run out of ammunition leapt out of the jungle and smashed Roy on the side of the head with their rifle butt, fracturing his skull. And so Roy falls to the ground and the soldier jumps on top of him and smashes his face, breaking his jaw. And then the soldier turns his rifle around. There's a bayonet on the front side and he begins impaling Roy over and over again. And Roy, like out of a movie, grabbed the rifle, pulled it out of himself, threw the soldier on the ground, jumped up, got on top of him, drew his Bowie knife, and proceeded to kill this soldier. And after he was done with that, he ran over to the two downed men. He grabbed one of them with his left hand. He picked up a rifle with the other. And as he's dragging this guy back to the chopper, he shoots and kills two more enemy combatants. So he finally gets this guy back to the chopper. He runs back, gets the last guy, throws him back in the helicopter. And then finally, Roy is the very last living American to hop in the helicopter, and the helicopter takes off. On the helo ride back, Roy was in very rough shape and had to literally hold his insides inside of his stomach. And so when they finally landed back at base and Roy was hauled off of this helicopter, he wasn't moving, and the doctors and nurses didn't really even know where to start with him. He had so many injuries. He had 37 significant holes in his body from gunshot wounds, from bayonet wounds, from shrapnel. And so they started trying to treat him, but there was no heartbeat, no pulse, and so they declared him dead. Roy's body was moved into a body bag, and as the doctor was zipping it up again, Roy spit in his face. Because Roy had no other way to communicate. His jaw was so badly broken from that rifle butt, he couldn't move his jaw, and his eyes were sealed shut from all the blood on his face that had dried. And so his only way to communicate was to spit. And so unbelievably, Roy was still alive. And so they took him out of the body bag and they shipped him to Japan for intensive surgery. And then he was transferred to Texas, where he spent a year rehabbing from his severe injuries. Roy was immediately given the Distinguished Service Cross and was put in for the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is the U.S. military's highest award for valor. But the paperwork took a really long time, and so Roy was not actually given the Congressional Medal of Honor until 1981. Of the 12 men that were trapped in that jungle, 8 would survive, all thanks to Roy Benavides. Roy passed away in 1998 as a result of complications from diabetes. He was 63 years old.
60-year-old Douglas Wise knelt down inside of his garden, pulling weeds out of the small vegetable patch behind his townhouse in Queens, New York. It was August 1999, and just like every other day that summer, it was hot and muggy. Doug's shirt stuck to his back as he worked. After he finished pulling up all the weeds, he sprayed the soil with some weed killer. He paused for a moment to admire the fat tomatoes ripening on the vines he'd planted that spring. He intended to use every one of them in homemade marinara sauce. When his garden was looking neat and trim, Doug gathered the weeds into a garbage bag and then took them to the compost bin inside of his garage. Doug tried not to gag as he opened the lid. On hot days like this, the bin could smell absolutely disgusting. He dumped the weeds onto the decaying pile of eggshells and table scraps. Then, to help the composting process along, he took a bucket of rainwater he'd collected the week before and poured a little into the bin. He smiled to himself, knowing how his wife Carmen quietly hated that he collected rainwater in large buckets, but it had actually come in handy earlier in the summer when they'd gone more than a month without rain. Doug had enough water for composting and a little extra for his garden, all while being able to conserve tap water. Doug closed the bin and then grabbed a beer from the garage refrigerator and sat in a folding chair on the porch near the sidewalk. After a few hours in his garden, Doug liked to have a drink and people watch. It was his idea of a perfect Sunday afternoon. When Doug finished the last of his beer, he tossed the can into a recycling bin and headed inside for a shower. He was careful not to touch anything on his way to the bathroom. Carmen had just cleaned the house from top to bottom, and she'd kill him if she saw dirt smudges on anything. After Doug rinsed off and had some dinner, he joined his wife in the living room to watch some TV. But as he sat there, he started to feel a headache come on, and so he began rubbing his temples, and he wondered if maybe staring at the screen and straining his eyes was causing this headache. So he asked his wife to turn off the TV. But even after she did, over the next few minutes, his headache only got worse. Doug finally went to the kitchen and took some aspirin. And while that did help his head feel a bit better, his stomach now started to feel queasy. And so Doug told his wife that he just didn't feel right, and so he was going to go to bed early. He wasn't sure if maybe he ate something bad, or if he was actually getting sick, like with the flu. Carmen agreed that he should just go to bed because after all, he'd spent the whole day in the yard under the beating sun. Doug kissed his wife goodnight and headed upstairs, hoping to feel better in the morning. But the next morning, when his alarm went off at 7 a.m., he was groggy and still had a headache, and his stomach still churned. Next to him, his wife had sat up, and she turned to him and said, you better get up if you don't want to be late for work. But Doug asked her to grab the phone for him because he felt absolutely terrible and he needed to call in sick. 3 days later, Carmen ladled some chicken noodle soup into a bowl, then placed it on a tray alongside a glass of ginger ale and some saltine crackers. Carefully, she carried it all up the stairs to the bedroom. Doug was in the bedroom, in bed, propped up on pillows. After 3 days of feeling totally sick, he'd lost a lot of fluids and looked very pale. As she set the tray onto the bedside table, she told her husband that she'd also bring him up a Gatorade. Carmen frowned as Doug nodded feebly. Her husband had been sick only a handful of times over the years, and when he was, it was rarely for more than 24 hours, and he had never been this weak and pale. Whatever bug her husband had caught, it had knocked him flat out. Carmen left the bedroom and headed downstairs to get the Gatorade from the fridge, and then when she had it, she went back up the stairs, and when she went back into the bedroom, she was surprised to see that Doug was not eating his soup. She asked if he was hungry, and Doug said that he was, but he said his hands were not steady enough to hold the bowl. Then he asked for Carmen's help walking to the bathroom. He said he was just too weak to get up on his own. Now Carmen was truly concerned. As she helped her husband to his feet and led him to the bathroom, she did her best to conceal her worry. Once Doug came out of the bathroom and was tucked back into his bed, Carmen asked him if he'd like her to feed him some soup. But Doug didn't respond. Instead, he just kind of stared out the window like he didn't even hear her. For several moments, Carmen spoke Doug's name with increasing urgency, but he just continued his glassy stare, saying nothing. Carmen was now terrified. She thought maybe Doug was having a stroke, so she grabbed the phone and called 911. It took a few minutes for an ambulance to arrive. While they waited, Carmen sat on the edge of the bed as Doug seemed to slip in and out of a trance, at times barely registering what was happening around him. By the time the paramedics arrived and moved Doug onto a stretcher, he was barely conscious. Carmen followed the paramedics downstairs and then out to the ambulance waiting in the driveway. She prayed silently as 2 EMTs hoisted up Doug's stretcher and secured it in the back of the ambulance. Then one of the men turned around and offered Carmen a hand, helping her into the back of the ambulance as well. Carmen took a seat on the bench, keeping one hand on her husband. As they sped towards the hospital, for the first time in her life, Carmen worried about losing her husband. Once the ambulance arrived at Flushing Hospital, Doug was rushed into the emergency room while a nurse brought Carmen to the waiting area. After about a half hour, a doctor wearing scrubs and a lab coat approached Carmen and brought her to Doug's room. Doug was lying in bed, still looking a bit out of it, with an IV hooked up to his arm. Carmen rushed over to him and kissed his forehead. The doctor told Carmen that he was fairly positive Doug had pneumonia, and if everything went well, he'd be back to normal in just a few days. Carmen squeezed Doug's shoulder, relieved to hear that he'd be okay. Later that same afternoon, the infectious disease specialist at Flushing Hospital, Dr. Debbie Asnes, was pouring herself a cup of coffee in the staff break room when her pager beeped. She checked the message and saw there was an emergency downstairs and she was needed right away. Dr. Asnes raised her eyebrows. It was unusual for the infectious disease specialist to be paged to the emergency room. If she was being called, it had to be a very unusual case that required outside-of-the-box thinking. And Dr. Asnes loved a challenge. Throughout her nearly 20 years as a doctor, she'd always been drawn to puzzling cases. She'd spent a lot of her career researching HIV, and she'd witnessed firsthand how bad things could get when doctors did not understand how a disease worked. So without a second thought, she set her coffee down, headed out of the break room, and ran to the elevator. The moment the elevator doors opened back up on the ER floor, she could hear a man's voice carrying down the hallway. He was yelling about some strange woman standing near his bed. As Dr. Asnes approached, the ER doctor who had paged her popped his head out of the man's room and waved her in. The patient who was yelling was Doug. For the first few hours he'd spent in the ER, he'd mostly just slept, but he'd woken up in a sudden panic, and now he was yelling incoherently at the people all around him. At the same time, Carmen, his wife, was standing by his side, trying to remind him who she was. As Dr. Asnes watched this, she immediately noticed something strange. Despite being agitated, Doug's arms and legs remained still and limp on the hospital bed. The ER doctor explained to Dr. Asnes that Doug was being treated for pneumonia, but the medical team was starting to think that that was not the right diagnosis. 10 minutes ago, Doug woke up confused and agitated and didn't recognize his wife. He started flailing his arms and the nurse ran in to restrain him, but then his arms and legs just went limp, and he'd not been able to move them since. Now Dr. Asnes understood why she had been called. Pneumonia does not make people paralyzed. Doug's symptoms were far more likely to have been caused by an infectious disease, and that was Dr. Asnes's area of expertise. And Dr. Asnes was very thankful the ER staff paged her so quickly because she now suspected that Doug's confusion was likely being caused by swelling in his brain, which is very, very dangerous. Just then, Doug suddenly went silent. Dr. Asnes bent over the bed and realized he was gasping for air. Dr. Asnes said that Doug needed to be moved to the intensive care unit in case his breathing got even worse. The ER doctor agreed and told the nurse to get Doug ready to move. Within minutes, the nurse and the ER doctor each grabbed a side of Doug's hospital bed and wheeled it out of the room. As she followed Doug, Dr. Asnes turned to Carmen and asked her to stay behind until they stabilized her husband. Then, as Doug was wheeled down the hallway, Dr. Asnes grabbed onto his bed to help steer him to the elevator. She was already thinking about which tests Doug would need. A few hours later, Dr. Asnes stood in her office reviewing Doug's charts. She had ordered a test of Doug's spinal fluid because to her, something was clearly wrong with his nervous system. But she was puzzled by the results she was looking at. The test found clear evidence of a brain infection called viral encephalitis, but Dr. Asnes was not sure that was correct. Although many of Doug's symptoms were consistent with viral encephalitis, it wouldn't explain his sudden muscle weakness. And Doug's breathing problems were more severe than the doctor normally saw in a case of viral encephalitis. Before Dr. Asnes could think any further, her pager sounded, and when she looked at it, she saw she was needed again in the emergency room. So Dr. Asnes ran back to the elevator, she took it down to the main floor of the hospital, and then she began running down the hallway towards the ER. But when she was only about halfway down the hallway, a colleague came out of the ER and ran right up to her and began telling her about the emergency that she was being called to. A man named Harold Marsh had been rushed in from his home in Queens, which was not far from Doug's home, after suffering a massive heart attack. But it wasn't the heart attack they wanted to talk to her about. They were afraid the heart attack was only part of this man's problems. The colleague from the ER explained to Dr. Asnes that like the first patient, Doug Wise, Harold, the second patient here, was older but active and healthy. His family reported that he had suddenly developed muscle weakness, flu symptoms, and worst of all, a staggeringly high 105-degree fever. Dr. Asnes felt a knot growing in her chest. Fevers that high were practically unheard of in heart attack patients. Dr. Asnes thanked her colleague and then just ordered Harold to be moved immediately to the ICU. Her mind was racing as she began to connect the dots. Two men living only blocks apart had both come down with the same mysterious symptoms in less than a week. This could be the beginning of an outbreak. For the moment, Harold was stable, so Dr. Asnes hurried back to her office to have some time to think. But as soon as she arrived on the 4th floor where her office was, she saw a nurse sprinting into Doug Wise's room. So Dr. Asnes ran down the hallway and went into Doug's room as well, just in time to see a colleague shove a breathing tube down Doug's throat and hook him up to a ventilator. The colleague, who was an ICU doctor, then explained to Dr. Asnes that Doug's muscle weakness was now so severe that his lungs had basically stopped working. Dr. Asnes was thankful her colleague had acted so quickly, but she was afraid this was only the first case of something much bigger. And if others out in the streets were contracting this virus, the consequences could be catastrophic. Dr. Asnes turned on her heel and rushed toward her office. She needed to alert the New York Health Department right away. Five days later, on August 27th, a medical investigator at the New York Department of Health hung up the phone in her office, wishing she'd never answered it in the first place. Her name was Annie Fine, and after a long week of work, she was ready to go home. She was knee-deep in planning her wedding, and she and her fiancé had wanted to knock out as many to-do items as possible over the weekend, but instead it looked like she would spend her weekend at Flushing Hospital. A doctor there had called in a potential outbreak on Monday, and after several days of discussions and 3 more patients in the hospital with identical symptoms, her boss had finally decided it was worth investigating. Dr. Fine reminded herself that, in all fairness, she was the on-call epidemiologist that weekend. That meant she would be responsible for any emergency that came up. But in addition, her boss and good friend, Dr. Marcy Layton, had asked her personally to help out. And she was always game to help Dr. Layton. So on Saturday morning, Dr. Fine woke up a minute before her alarm clock began screeching. She managed to turn it off before it had the chance to wake her fiancé, and then she quietly got out of bed. Half an hour later, she headed down the stairs of her apartment building and saw Dr. Layton's car parked outside. She smiled as she jumped into the passenger seat, and Dr. Layton laughed and apologized for interrupting her weekend plans. Then Dr. Layton handed Dr. Fine a cup of to-go coffee, and they peeled off toward Flushing Hospital. After a short drive, Dr. Fine and Dr. Layton parked near the hospital and climbed out of the car. As soon as Dr. Layton had stepped onto the curb, she made a disgusted noise, and Dr. Fine turned to look at what she was disgusted at, and she saw there was a dead crow lying in the gutter right near Dr. Layton's feet. Both doctors had been seeing dead crows all over New York that entire summer. So they both just walked around the dead bird, and the 2 women headed for the hospital. Right outside the ICU, the 2 doctors were greeted by a tall, thin man wearing a lab coat. He told Dr. Fine that he was the chief resident, which meant he was a doctor in training, standing in for Dr. Asnes, who was out of town on a family emergency. He explained that in the 5 days since Dr. Asnes first called the Department of Health about her first 2 patients, 3 more people had been admitted to Flushing Hospital with symptoms of viral encephalitis. All 5 were older people who were previously healthy and active. Most worrisome, all 5 also had other symptoms not normally caused by viral encephalitis, including fever, stomach pain, confusion, muscle weakness, and severe difficulty breathing. The chief resident added that all 5 patients had declined really quickly. 4 were now on ventilators, and the 5th was not, but they were delirious with pain. Dr. Fine felt unnerved. All of a sudden, wedding planning was the last thing on her mind. There were usually only about 10 viral encephalitis cases every year in all of New York City. But now, one small neighborhood in New York City had 5 cases in less than a week, and so far, nobody had figured out why. Dr. Fine asked the resident to go collect blood samples from each of these patients and submit them for additional testing. In the meantime, she and Dr. Layton would interview the patients' families and anyone else who was with these people in the week leading up to their hospitalization. The resident nodded and then led Dr. Fine and Dr. Layton to an empty conference room where they could call people and interview them. Dr. Layton would ask the questions and Dr. Fine would take notes. By that afternoon, Dr. Fine's writing hand was totally cramped. She spent hours taking notes as she and Dr. Layton spoke with the patient's family members. Outside, it was starting to get dark, so Dr. Fine rolled her chair toward the wall and switched on the overhead lights. The conference room table was littered with textbooks, stacks of medical journals, and reports on annual encephalitis cases in New York. Dr. Fine looked over at Dr. Layton and sighed. Despite hours of interviews and poring over the patients' files, they still did not know how these 5 patients in Flushing Hospital had contracted encephalitis. But they had found that all 5 patients had 2 things in common. First, that they all lived within a few square miles from one another in Queens, and second, they all loved to spend time outdoors in the evenings. A few of the patients, like Doug Wise, the first patient, would work in their gardens until nightfall. Others just liked to watch the sunset from their back decks or take long walks along the East River after dinner. Dr. Fine looked out the window as the street lamps flickered to life, and right as they did, it hit her. People were not the only ones who loved summer evenings. It's also the time when mosquitoes are at their most active. All 5 of their encephalitis patients were probably swatting away mosquitoes as they gardened or walked or gazed at the sunset in the gathering darkness each night. And Dr. Fine knew something else about mosquitoes. They spread disease. Diseases like encephalitis, a condition that often strikes older people like Doug and Harold more frequently. Dr. Layton was intrigued by Dr. Fine's idea, but she was cautious. If mosquitoes really were spreading some new virus to people, they should be able to find mosquitoes infected with the disease. And so until they were able to isolate the virus in mosquitoes, then Dr. Fine's idea was really just a theory. Before the doctors left the hospital that night, Dr. Fine wrote up an alert that Dr. Layton sent to all the neighboring hospitals, asking them to report any cases of viral encephalitis to the Department of Health. That way, she and Dr. Layton would know if the virus was spreading. 2 days later, on the morning of September 1st, Dr. Fine sat at her desk, twisting her pencil in her hands. She was back in her office, feeling frustrated by the lab results she had just read. That morning, she and Dr. Layton had sent a small team to northern Queens, where all these patients had lived, and the job of this team was to canvass that neighborhood and visit the houses of each encephalitis patient and try to find breeding mosquitoes. Well, that team collected several samples of mosquito larvae from standing water around the neighborhood, but none of those mosquitoes were infected with viral encephalitis. Meanwhile, Dr. Fine was still waiting for lab work to come back on the blood samples she'd collected from the 5 infected patients. While Dr. Fine thought about what she should do next, Dr. Layton knocked on her door. She said she had bad news. One of the encephalitis patients, Harold Marsh, had grown so weak that the doctors determined he would not recover. Moments ago, the family had decided to take him off life support. Dr. Fine's heart broke for Harold and his family. She was frustrated that she couldn't even tell them for certain what had killed their loved one. It felt like they were back at square one. But, at the very least, Dr. Fine knew that the doctors at Flushing Hospital would be able to do an autopsy and take tissue samples they couldn't get while Harold was alive. Dr. Fine hoped that these samples could help them identify the virus and warn the public at large. The following morning, Dr. Fine walked into her office to find her boss, Dr. Layton, waiting for her with news about Harold Marsh's autopsy tissue samples. Tests indicated that Harold had died of something called St. Louis encephalitis, a very rare strain of the disease that's only spread by mosquitoes. Dr. Layton said that federal health officials had also checked the blood samples from the other 4 encephalitis patients in Queens, and they found that they too had tested positive for St. Louis encephalitis. All 5 of the patients had gotten sick from mosquito bites. Dr. Fine frowned. On the one hand, it was nice to know that her theory that mosquitoes could have caused this was in fact what caused this, but this diagnosis didn't really make sense. The patient's symptoms were all consistent with St. Louis encephalitis, but there had never been a reported case of St. Louis encephalitis in New York City until now. In fact, there were only about 30 reported cases a year in the entire United States, and these were almost exclusively in southern swamplands. Dr. Fine wondered if infected mosquitoes had somehow migrated north, but if they had, there would have been cases of it in other places along the eastern seaboard, and so far, the only cases of it were from this outbreak in Queens. Something just didn't add up. Dr. Fine told Dr. Layton that she was glad they finally knew what was going on, but deep down, she still could not shake the feeling that there was something off about this diagnosis. A few weeks later, Dr. Fine was in her office at the Department of Health when Dr. Layton knocked on the door. When she came in, she had a very serious expression on her face. Dr. Layton explained that she'd just gotten off the phone with the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, and Dr. Fine's suspicions were correct. The virus they were investigating was not actually St. Louis encephalitis. It was much worse. A pathologist at the Bronx Zoo, of all places, had figured out the mistake. She'd been trying to understand why all these birds were dying all over the city, and she had discovered that they were actually contracting some form of encephalitis. And then after she learned about the St. Louis encephalitis outbreak in the city, she began to investigate whether that was what was killing all these birds. But tissue samples from the dead birds showed no sign of St. Louis encephalitis. Instead, the birds had a different strain that can easily be confused with the St. Louis strain, but it's actually much more dangerous. And the birds were loaded with this different strain. In fact, the birds got this strain of encephalitis at such a high concentration that a mosquito sucking their blood could pass on the disease to the next creature it bites, including humans. And sure enough, when the CDC retested the blood of the patients at Flushing Hospital, they found that they too had the same strain of encephalitis as the birds. This strain is known as West Nile virus. West Nile is something that likely lots of people have heard of, but it's actually even more rare than the St. Louis strain, at least in the United States, because until this point, it had never been seen in the United States. It was only really seen in Africa. The CDC suspected that an infected mosquito from some other part of the world had found its way onto a plane maybe, and then come to the US that way, or maybe a sick bird had gotten onto a boat, and that's how the disease came to the United States. But now that this disease had crossed the ocean and arrived in the US, Dr. Fine knew it was here to stay. By the time the CDC put the puzzle together, as many as 1,900 residents of northern Queens were infected with West Nile virus. 62 people landed in the hospital, and 7 people died that summer in 1999 before the mosquitoes disappeared with the fall. And in the years since those initial cases, over 56,000 people have been infected in the United States. 2,776 have died as of 2022. Although the mortality rate of St. Louis encephalitis and West Nile is comparable, West Nile is far more dangerous. Because it can be carried by birds, West Nile has spread to all 50 states, while St. Louis encephalitis remains fairly localized and far less common. Doug Wise, the first patient to come in with West Nile, remained in Flushing Hospital for several weeks before he was healthy enough to transfer to a physical rehabilitation facility where he stayed for the next month. By spring of 2000, Doug was able to walk with the assistance of a special cane, but his left side never regained its former strength, and he continued to suffer episodes of short-term memory loss. But ultimately, Doug knew he was one of the lucky ones from that painful summer of 1999. He could at least still tend to his garden as long as he wore his mosquito repellent.
Morning of September 23rd, 1839, an experienced sailor named Captain Brighton stood on the deck of his ship, which was traveling through the Drake Passage, which is located right along the northern coast of Antarctica. He and his crew had sailed here because they were professional whalers, and they had heard there was this massive population of whales in the Drake Passage that basically were untouched by humanity because basically nobody sailed this far. This was a freezing cold, very austere part of the world, kind of a dangerous place to be. But so far, Captain Brighton and his crew had not seen a single whale. And on top of that, the Drake Passage had proven to be as dangerous as expected. Just the previous night, the ocean around the ship had literally frozen, basically anchoring the ship in place. And so when this happened, Captain Brighton realized, there was nothing they could even do about this. I mean, they were stuck. And if this didn't break up soon, they'd be stuck here all winter potentially, and it was unclear if they could actually survive that. But fortunately, also the previous night, this massive storm rolled in, which, that's dangerous in and of itself. But the severity of the storm was actually a good thing because it broke up the ice around the ship and allowed Captain Brighton to sail away. And so now, that morning, the ocean was again, liquid, so they were able to move around. But Captain Brighton had a very difficult decision to make. Again, so far they have not caught any whales, and they've invested a lot of time and money to get out here. But, if he stayed out here much longer, he knew they could potentially get stranded again, and he just couldn't let that happen. And so he needed to decide if he was going to keep on sailing further into the Drake Passage to maybe find a couple whales, or leave now before it was too late. But as Captain Brighton weighed his options, he suddenly noticed something over the horizon. There was this dark shape. And at first, he actually thought he was hallucinating, because really, there's nothing else out here. It's just him and ocean and ice. That was it. But as he continued to stare in the direction of this dark object, which was actually getting closer to him, he realized it was a real thing, and in fact, it was another ship, which was really surprising, because again, nobody really comes out here. And so his instincts were, okay, this has got to be a rival whale ship. I mean, that's the only other people who would come out here. But as he continued to stare at the ship, as it got closer, he realized it was not a whale ship. It was actually a schooner, which is a ship designed for traveling. But as Captain Brighton stared at the schooner that was getting closer and closer, he saw it was in pretty rough shape. I mean, the hull and the sails were very tattered. I mean, there was something off about the ship. But Captain Brighton was thinking, hey, I know you can get trapped in the ice out here. It happened to them the night before. Maybe this crew has gotten trapped in the ice. They've been stuck out here for who knows how long. They could be in pretty rough shape. And Captain Brighton knew they actually did have, at least at that moment, quite a bit of supplies, at least some to spare. And so he called out to his men to ready a dinghy and get some supplies because they were going to go over to this schooner and basically offer up some extra supplies and also check in on them and make sure they were okay. And so once the supplies were packaged up and put on the dinghy, Captain Brighton, along with 4 other men, hopped in the dinghy and they began paddling over to the schooner. And as they got closer, the waves were pretty bad. And so they're kind of jostling around and, the ship itself, the schooner is also moving. And so that's moving up and down. But, periodically as they got closer, they'd be able to look into the portholes, which are like windows on the side of the schooner. And Captain Brighton could clearly see there were people inside of the schooner. He called out a few times, but it was windy and sort of loud. And he couldn't really tell if any of them heard him or if anybody called back. And so eventually, Captain Brighton and his crew, they got to the side of the schooner and they just climbed up the ladder and boarded the ship. And once they were on the ship, once they were on the deck of the schooner, they're looking around and everything was in working order, albeit sort of tattered and in rough shape. But the weird thing is nobody was out on deck. They had seen people in the portholes, which was inside the ship, but there was nobody above deck. And so Captain Brighton's thinking, okay, this is pretty weird here, but we clearly just need to go inside and talk to someone. And so Captain Brighton and his men walked across the deck to this door that led into the ship. It actually led into the captain's quarters, at least, based on basic ship construction, that's what they expected it to be. And so Captain Brighton, he gets to the door, he knocks and calls out, announces that they're here with supplies and just to make sure everybody is okay. But there's no answer. All they can hear is the slapping of the water against the ship. There's no voices, there's nothing. It's silent on the ship. And so Captain Brighton eventually just opens up this door, and sure enough, he looks into this dark space, and it's the captain's quarters. And there's a desk towards the back of this room, and there's a man sitting at the desk with his back to them. And so Captain Brighton, he takes a cautious step into the captain's quarters, and he calls out to this man who clearly appears to be the captain. But the man doesn't say or do anything. He's clearly focused on something at his desk. And so Captain Brighton exchanged a worried glance with his men and then just decided he would walk across the room and go physically interact with this guy and make sure he was okay and see what was going on here. And so slowly, Captain Brighton began walking across the room, and as he did, he called out a few more times to this man who appeared to be the captain, but he didn't get a response. And then finally, he was right behind the man, and he actually looked down and read what the man had been writing. This is what it said. Trapped by icebergs. Despite all efforts, the fire went out last night. No hope remains. However, as unsettling as that would be to read for anybody in this situation, what was the most unsettling part was actually what was written right above that journal entry. The date. January 17th, 1823, 16 years before. That captain and his entire crew were all dead, and had been for 16 years. They got trapped in the ice just like Captain Brighton had, but it didn't break up. They were stranded, and they all froze to death. And because it was so cold out in that part of the world, all their bodies were basically preserved in their final moments. And so the captain of the ship, before he died, was making an entry to say what happened. And then down below, when Captain Brighton and his men went to go look, they found people playing cards who had literally frozen to death while playing cards. They found a woman lying in her bed with her dog. That's how they froze to death. They found people in the dining hall, and they died right where they were sitting. It was like all these people had been frozen in time for nearly 2 decades, just floating around in Drake's Passage. And basically nobody had found them until Captain Brighton. On the night of May 20th, 1958, a young man named Ram Thapa walked towards the entrance of an abandoned airport in eastern India. He was trailing behind 3 other men. They were his boss, another employee of his boss, and then a friend of his boss. It was pitch black outside, and so all 4 men had flashlights. But Ram also had something else. He had a huge knife. So the reason they were there is Ram's boss was considering buying this airport. However, there were these rumors floating around that this airport was now haunted ever since being abandoned. In fact, people said, the old hangars and rusted out buildings were infested with ghosts. Now, Ram totally believed that this place really was haunted. But Ram's boss wanted to go and check it out, before he actually considered really buying this place. And so he had recruited these 3 other guys, Ram included, to go basically on a ghost hunt. And so going into this, Ram's boss and the 2 other men, they're sort of like, okay, this is intriguing. It's kind of funny that we're going on this ghost hunt. But Ram, he was terrified. He did not like the idea of going into this airport, especially at night. He fully believed there were ghosts out here. He had brought the knife along to protect himself from ghosts. But his boss was basically telling him that he had to go, and so Ram was there. And so Ram's boss reached the gate, he unlocked it, and pushed it open. And as it slowly swung open, it made this horrible creaking sound. And for the first time, all 4 men are getting an unobstructed view into the actual property. And it's totally, again, pitch black, and they're shining their lights inside, and all they see are just these old hangars and different big buildings and broken down planes, but there's no movement. It's totally dark and it's quiet. And so Ram's boss and the other 2 men, they're walking along, and Ram's in the back, and he's so uneasy, he feels practically sick to his stomach. Everywhere he looked, he would think that he saw a shadow, a ghost staring back at him, but he would shine the light and, nothing would be there. And so this whole time they're walking, he's totally on edge. And eventually they reached the actual runway. And when they got there, instead of shining their lights kind of straight out in front of them, because there was basically nothing out ahead of them, it was just, where planes go to take off and to land, they began shining their lights predominantly off to the side, where there was this huge hangar, and they were all shining their lights in the different windows to see if, anybody was inside of there. And so they're all kind of focused off to the side, and Ram, the whole time, he's totally terrified here. And as, his boss and his friends are kind of shining their lights over here, Ram takes his flashlight and he aims it straight out in front of them. And he sees maybe a couple 100 meters away, just off to the side of the runway, is what appears to be this floating orb. And immediately he keeps his light trained on this orb, and he signals to his boss and the others like, hey, look at this. And they all turn, and they're kind of like, joking around, and they shine their light, and they also see it. They see this floating orb. It made no sense. They noticed that there was not just this orb of light, but there was something below the orb of light, like on the ground. Something was moving, this grayish figure, or multiple figures were kind of like moving around right beneath this orb. But before any of them could say or do anything or react really in any way to whatever it was they were looking at, the dark figures right below the orb, as they're being illuminated by all their flashlights, it was like all of a sudden, whatever they were, they turned, and all these eyes glinted and looked directly back at Ram and his colleagues. And it was like something inside of Ram just clicked. He was so scared. He'd been terrified from the moment they got here, and the whole time he had been so primed to protect himself if he had to with this knife. And it was like when he saw these eyes, he didn't have any idea what they were, but he knew they were evil, and if he didn't act, they were doomed. And so, without saying anything to his boss or the other two men, with knife in hand, Ram took off running towards the figures. A few hours later, Ram and his colleagues were no longer at the airport. Instead, they were at the police station, and Ram was in handcuffs. It would turn out those figures that they spotted that Ram went to go confront with his knife were not actually ghosts. Instead, they were three women who had come onto the airfield as well, but just to pick flowers. That orb of light that the men had seen was just their lantern. Ram had been so convinced they were ghosts that he had taken off and attacked them with his knife, believing he was not only protecting himself, but protecting his boss and the other two men. However, he had been wrong. These were just women, and he killed one of them and severely wounded the other two. And so ultimately, he was charged with murder and assault. However, when he went on trial, he was actually acquitted of all charges because the jury genuinely believed that Ram actually thought he was attacking ghosts, not people. On April 9th, 2005, in Kaohsiung City, Taiwan, a young man was home alone inside of his apartment watching TV. And as he sat there watching TV, he heard a loud thumping sound coming from right above him. As soon as he heard it, he muted his TV and he listened for a second, and a minute later, he heard it again, a loud thump. And then he heard another one, and another one, and another one, and before long, all he heard was a succession of thumps and also what sounded like chanting coming from upstairs. However, as unusual as these types of sounds might be to the average person, to this young man, these actually weren't that weird. Because the family that lived right above him, the Wu family, were pretty eccentric. They were very religious people who often did these ceremonial dances and rituals at all hours, and a lot of times they involved stomping around and chanting really loudly. And as annoying as that could be, this young man never complained. He was very respectful of the Wu family, and he knew, these sounds he was hearing were connected to their religion, and he felt like that was none of his business. And so, like he did basically every other time he would hear these noises, he simply turned the volume up on his TV and tried to forget about them. But after a few minutes, it was like the noises coming from upstairs just kept getting louder and louder and louder until it was basically impossible to ignore. And then suddenly he heard a scream coming from upstairs that certainly did not feel attached to a ceremony. It sounded like somebody was in danger or in trouble or something. And so at that point, the young man turned the TV off and he stood up and he thought, I need to go up there and make sure things are okay. I mean, forget being annoyed. It sounds like, someone's in trouble or someone's hurt or something. But as he began making his way towards his door to go upstairs and check on the Wu family, all the noises just completely stopped and it was silent upstairs. And at that point, the young man just stopped where he was. And for a minute, he just listened, waiting to see if maybe the noises would pick back up again. But they didn't. And so the young man just turned around, walked back to his seat, and turned the TV back on. 2 days later, on April 11th, that same young man was back home all alone, watching TV yet again, when, once again, he heard a loud pounding sound. Except this time, it was not coming from upstairs, it was coming from his front door. Somebody was hammering on his front door trying to get his attention. And so the young man turned off the TV, he got up, and he went over to his door, he opened it up, and standing there on the landing was this middle-aged man named Wu Shan, who was the patriarch of the Wu family upstairs. And Wu Shan looked absolutely horrible. He was dressed all in black head to toe, but he was pale and skinny and very gaunt, and he was covered in what looked like filth, like food and ash, and he smelled unbelievably horrible. And the young man, he asked Wu Shan, hey, is everything okay? And remember, the young man's thinking about that crazy, loud ceremony they had just 2 days earlier, wondering, whatever happened with that? That was so loud. But Wu Shan just looked back at the young man with this kind of vacant expression. And he just said, call an ambulance. And then, without saying anything else, Wu Shan turned, ran down the steps, and disappeared out into the street. And so at this point, the young man is left just standing there having no idea what to think. I mean, Wu Shan did not look well and he's now run away. And again, this young man is thinking about that bizarre ritual he overheard a couple of days ago that just kind of stopped abruptly after screams were heard. Now he's being told to call an ambulance. And so he's thinking, I better go upstairs and make sure things are okay before I do anything else. And so the young man left his apartment, went upstairs to the Wu family's apartment, and the door was shut. But even standing outside the door, he began to smell that same absolutely horrible smell that he smelled on Wu Shan. And so he knocks on the Wu family's door. He's kind of covering his nose, but he doesn't get a response. Nobody comes to the door. And so after looking around, he just tried the doorknob and he found it was unlocked. And so, pretty apprehensively, but knowing he needed to see what was going on here, he opened up the door and right away he's hit with another wave of just this disgusting smell. He can barely breathe, but nonetheless, he steps into the house and he calls out to anybody, anyone come over here and tell me what's going on. But nobody called back. And he kind of looked around the family's apartment and it was totally filthy. There was just this grime all over everything. And he made his way all the way into the living room. And there he stopped because in the middle of the living room on the floor, he saw something that he just simply couldn't believe. It would turn out the Wu family had performed a ritual 2 days earlier. That was the sounds that the neighbor downstairs had been hearing. Those loud stomping and screaming, all that stuff was a ceremony like the family was known to do. However, that ceremony got totally out of hand. So in the weeks leading up to that ceremony, one of the Wu family's daughters came down with an illness. And because the family didn't have a lot of money, they couldn't send her to the doctor. And after a couple of days, when she didn't get better, the family decided that, okay, well, she must not be physically sick. She must be spiritually sick, meaning she was possessed by a demon. And so at first, they tried some ceremonies to ward off this demon, but it wasn't really working. And then before long, the rest of the members of the family began complaining that maybe they too were also possessed by the same demon. And before long, that was the belief that the entire Wu family shared, that they all were possessed by demons. And so on the day the downstairs neighbor heard all that stomping and chanting and screaming, that was the day that the Wu family performed a big group exorcism to try to get rid of these demons once and for all from all of them. But the way they did this exorcism was truly horrifying. They believed that the one thing demons were afraid of was filth. And so they decided that if they filled their bodies with enough filth, the demons would leave. And so the Wu family, as they chanted and stomped around and screamed, began consuming their own feces. And when they would vomit it back up again, they would just swallow it right back down for hours and hours and hours. What the downstairs neighbor actually discovered inside the living room of the Wu family's apartment was the daughter, the one who originally had gotten sick, and she was laying on the ground and was deceased. And during the autopsy, they would discover that her airway was totally blocked by feces and vomit. By the time the downstairs neighbor made this discovery, the entire Wu family had fled the apartment. Wu Shan had disappeared after saying calling an ambulance, and the rest of the family too had kind of run off. But the police would ultimately track down all the remaining Wu family members and they would all be arrested. However, a court ultimately decided that the Wu family was suffering from something known as mass hysteria. And as a result of that, they could not be held legally accountable for what they did. And so, they were all acquitted. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, Mr. Ballen Presents Where Nightmares Live is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are gonna sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting.